Hello everyone, and welcome back to History Behind the Games. Governments are interesting structures. They are there to help organize and provide safety and other benefits. They also mismanage tax funds and are a target for many of the complaints of the people. They have taken many forms, be it monarchies and oligarchies. Sometimes power is concentrated in a small handful of powerful nobles, or placed in the trust of a few hundred politicians elected by the people. Governments, while made up of individuals, are complex. It is their job to handle much of the organization of society so that common people can live in relative peace and thrive, which makes governments more powerful. This doesn't always happen, but it's the essential goal of most forms of bureaucracy. In our present time, we are so used to them being around that we often make movies and games that wonder what life would be like if they had suddenly vanished. But for much of human history, and I mean around 99 to 99.2% of it, governments as we know them did not exist. So how did they form in the first place? And how did they become so prevalent? Today I won't take a look at any specific society, but give a general story of how the first governments came into being. But before we begin, be sure to subscribe and like the video to help grow the channel, and click the bell button to be notified for more history and game videos. Also, check out the History Behind the Games Patreon page and join others to help support more history. Before cities and villages, which also meant no government, people lived in what we call today hunter-gatherer groups for hundreds of thousands of years. Much of our body's evolutionary makeup and functions stem from this time period. There were chiefs, shamans, and some other cultural structures, of course, but everyone had to contribute to the group just to survive. Much of the day was spent hunting or gathering food, with perhaps some time left over to create practical tools or the odd religious figure or artwork. Decisions had to be made at times for where to hunt, where to set up camp, what direction they should move in, and if they should trade with a neighboring band. This was often decided by a majority of group members. Basically, it was a very small direct democracy. But none of this required the complex decision-making that larger governments would handle in the future. But with the development of agriculture, some peoples began settling in a single area to cultivate the crops. This takes place around 4,000 to 2,000 years ago in the Americas, and 10,000 to 11,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. This meant that more permanent structures had to be imagined and then built. The crops provided a steady food source, and the combination of domesticating animals, such as goats for example, meant that going on long hunts and spending most of the day gathering food became a shorter or less frequent process. Shortening the food gathering process meant much more free time in the day was available, allowing for more specialized trades to be learned. More dependable food sources meant that parents felt safe having more children, with the added benefit that the children would be helping out in the fields. This allowed for the population to rise wherever agriculture was practiced. But larger populations did have their problems. With more free time, and some people now focusing on specific jobs in the developing society, how would everyone know that they were contributing their fair share? Today we calculate all that through taxes, but who would help collect and then redistribute those taxes thousands of years ago? In hunter-gatherer groups, this was easy to figure out. Everyone needed to do some job that benefited the group, which often meant bringing food a majority of the time. But how would the non-farmers contribute in settled areas? Not everyone would have equal time to devote to agriculture if they were learning other professions, such as making clothes or building tools using metal. But these other practices still fell into the category of fair share through trade, which might have helped the first governments to take form. The farmer can give some of their surplus in trade to a tailor for some clothes, giving the tailor some much-needed food, allowing them to spend their time making more clothes. The farmer, on the other hand, has more time to better cultivate their crops for better yields, because they don't have to set aside time to make clothes. If this happened often enough, the tailor eventually wouldn't need to grow food at all, because their work brought in enough resources solely through trading. People in these settled areas became less self-sufficient and would rely ever more on the work of others. This would have taken place over several decades or generations after the first settlements. Now let's say the farmer gets the clothes on credit, his word, because the crops haven't come in yet, but he needs clothes for his kids now. Okay, fair enough. But when the harvest does come in, he doesn't give the previously promised amount to the tailor. What is the tailor to do? He could try to risk life and limb by trying to take the food forcefully, and then be in danger of familial retaliation afterwards for who knows how long. Or, the tailor can ask someone, whom most people in the small community trust, to hear out his dilemma and make a decision. Soon, other people may come to the person, we'll call them Alex, and ask Alex to settle their disputes. Alex may be of some level of importance already. He or she may have been a de facto leader, the commander of the hunting party, or some other prominent figure that everyone would know and who can already make decisive, fair decisions. Alex and Alex's immediate descendants, as the population grew, may have had to settle problems, disputes, and organize protection so much that they may not have had as much time as others to continue to work producing goods and services in their own right. Eventually, they would begin to take payment for their decision-making services. And someone after that might have had the bright idea to offer other services they could think of, like accounting of trade, to provide more organization to their small village. Possibly this would also lead to them hiring a few others to help them keep records, to help in the decision-making. Since these people were being entrusted to make judgments, in time, nearly everyone in the community would just have their issues or problems settled by these decision-makers and record-keepers. Of course, there are always exceptions, but the majority of humanity most likely fell into this habit. And once the community had a set of standards to abide by, generally, there were more peaceful interactions among people, which allowed society in these villages and small cities to grow larger and more complex. Early charity and welfare, which was normal in hunter-gatherer groups, became more structured. Credit and trade called for writing to be developed to keep track of orders. Large populations staying in one area needed new customs and inventions to make life bearable for this new mode of stationary living. Heroes and other prominent people began to be recognized for their extraordinary skills, and were given more privileged positions in society, provided they had the support, to use those skills for the greater good. These were the first developing kings, queens, and rulers. But as the population grew even further from more births and new people moving in from other regions, some villages grew larger into small cities, which meant that not everyone in the communities were going to know one another. Some ground rules needed to be established so that everyone could be on the same page and that there wouldn't be chaos in the streets. Some of these decisions might seem barbaric to us today, such as Hammurabi's eye for an eye laws and others like it, but it did serve the goal of creating rules for the community. Whether these rules were religious in influence or purely decided by the person in charge, they were decided for those living in the area. And to help ensure that everyone was following the rules, groups of people were chosen to either police the city or create and store records, sometimes both. Since these people were to spend their day doing these beneficial practices for the community, they did not have time to grow food or produce goods either, much like the rulers. So the community was most likely asked at first to provide some food and goods to be stored away as payment for these new civic authorities. Anyone moving into the society or born into it afterward would then just be told that they had to pay in order to get the society going. And if they didn't pay, there would be punishment for not providing as everyone else did. The first taxes came into being. Taxes could range from crops, the earliest forms of money and coinage, or simply labor for government building projects. Sometimes more taxes were paid than what was needed to compensate civic authorities, so the young governments might spend it hiring or at least providing supplies for labor on new buildings such as walls or temples. They would almost certainly keep some extra for themselves, making those at the top of the government structures, those who controlled the tax wealth and distribution, more powerful and rich in the process. So now we have a better idea of how governments grew, became more complex, grew some more, and so on. But this did not happen overnight for all peoples on Earth. Most of this early governmental development only emerged in a few locations on the planet. It was the exception, not the rule, especially several thousand years ago. So how did governments become the norm? And how did hunter-gatherer groups react to them? In order to build new structures and homes, to grow crops and other things, these cities needed more land and resources. That's all well and good until they realized that not all land was essentially useful to them. Owning a rocky mountain range wasn't going to produce as much food as a fertile plain would. Owning a stretch of desert flats wasn't going to be as productive as land that had access to fresh water. What made matters worse was that everyone in the region knew that too. The nomads followed the herds that ate the vegetation grown in the fertile places, or brought their own pastoral herds. Some of the earliest recordings of history in the Fertile Crescent, for instance, describes conflict and warfare, especially with the more nomadic peoples outside the cities. But similarly around the world, the same land that the nomads or hunter-gatherers used for their lifestyle were the same ones the early cities needed to use for farming. Cities needed to expand into, cut down, or take over resources to secure them for their own use. A common belief began to arise in the more urban populace that people who did not live in the city, and especially those who did not even adhere to the settled culture, were archaic, barbaric, and uncivilized. Uncivilized practically meaning someone who wasn't civil, a non-civilian, a non-city dweller. Obviously, this was not taken too lightly by more nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples. Conflict arose. Nomads often had speed or terrain knowledge to their advantage, while urban dwellers had the numbers and the time to create better arms and armor. These types of conflicts did not stop for thousands of years. From the Sumerians and Akkadians against the hill tribes, to the Turks and Mongols wreaking havoc across Eurasia from ancient to medieval times, to the 19th century on the American plains, the native tribes against the US military. There's no real end to the major nomadic lifestyle until the 20th century, when some of the last remaining nomadic peoples in the world, in Kyrgyzstan and other places in Central Asia, were forced to change into city dwellers within the Soviet Union. Many nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples resisted cities, fought them, and raided them and their trade routes for many centuries. But conflict was only part of the story. Due to cities developing many useful and desired technologies and goods, nomads and hunter-gatherers often traded with urban peoples as much as they fought them. Many nomads often became the middlemen between distant cities, bringing goods from their own frontier and merchandise from one city to another. The Bedouin peoples, for example, also popularly known as Bedouins, served such a function from ancient history up until the mid-20th century. They could also charge a trespassing tax or tribute in order to pass through their lands without being raided or killed, such as some Native American tribes in the 1700s and early 1800s, taking a payment of furs and other goods from fur trappers. Other groups could be paid by a city in goods to go raid one of their enemies, or for protection from others, most likely becoming the first mercenaries in history. The point is that nomadic and settled peoples often interacted in some way, shape, or form in an economic system that worked for both groups. Some transactions or trades might have been violent or forced, with others being mutually beneficial. But slowly, cities with their advantage in numbers, ability to produce goods and resources on a massive scale, and being able to provide a more plentiful standard of living than any nomad could, drove many people to increasingly move into cities over the centuries. While nomads against urbanites was one dilemma, the bigger threat to a city would be another city. Conflicts with nomads could be dangerous, but another city threatening your entire population and resources could be downright disastrous. The early city-states in their respective regions in the world, whether that be in the Fertile Crescent or the Mayan Yucatan, competed with each other and fought for dominance to gain more power and resources, with some beginning to believe that they were fulfilling some supernatural or divine right to conquer as well. For whatever the reason, warfare in many early societies called for all free men, and at times women as well, to take up arms to defend the city or be promised part of the spoils when taking another. Again, religious and social rights could have been added onto these reasons, providing a mentally deeper sense of purpose to the fight. Before the standardization of armies centuries or millennia later, many had to provide their own weapons and perhaps take others from those who had lost them in battle. Since warfare was becoming larger, more organization was required and tactics began to show. Different weapons developed for different purposes, or improvements on old ones, began to show up in history. Spears and axes made with metal instead of stone, more powerful bows to shoot arrows through armor, the combination of animal and weapon in the form of chariots, and much more. Kings had to hire generals to help organize their armies, since they were too busy running a city to devote all their time to it. Generals then needed to hire others to help train the troops, or at least help in mustering militia levies when they were called up. To denote who needed to listen to who in the armies, and to make sure more experienced people were in charge of less experienced, different ranks began to be created. Some earned rank by training, wealth, or having it granted to them by higher authorities. Earlier armies weren't perfect, but it was a start. Still others had to create new weapons and armor full-time. Urban life allowed for some of the new city engineers to become the first military contractors, to sit down and really think on how to improve weapons, fortifications, and warfare, an action that still goes on to this day. Large battles were more decisive than small raids, such as the nomads and hunter-gatherers would do. Hit-and-run tactics might kill a few and gain a few stolen goods, but a large battle could end an entire conflict in a day, transferring control and resources much faster than the never-ending raids and feuds. If the goal was just to take land, losers could find themselves slaughtered or enslaved if they lost. If the objective was to take control of another city and its resources, battles were actually conducted more carefully. The commanding king would not want to wholesale slaughter an enemy army unless absolutely necessary, because those warriors would be his future farmers, cultivating his new lands. This is where sometimes we see challenges between single heroes deciding a conflict, such as the famed story of David and Goliath. Some rulers began to take over multiple cities, meaning governmental structures and administrations had to grow and evolve to manage multiple dwelling places miles apart. New officials were promoted, having their own staffs. The ruler might need a governor to command their other city. That governor would have to hire reliable people to manage trade, security, and safety, and hire others still to micromanage the small outlying villages springing up nearby. All these administrators gained varying levels of power and responsibilities, with the people not in those positions having to support them. Society and cities became very stratified, with differences in wealth and privilege. Government, along with society, was getting more complex. But one more aspect was needed to make cities grow even more, which would be partially helped through government facilitation. Trade is one of the main actions of human history. Hunter-gatherer groups have engaged in it since prehistory. Ancient governments, cities, and peoples took part in it on a regular basis. Every time we buy an item or service from a store, or pay for something online, like a certain Patreon page, we are trading currency, a representation of our time and labor for goods and services we want or need. Before large cities, hunter-gatherers, nomad groups, and small villages largely bartered for what they wanted. Goods and services were traded for other goods and services. There were no prices like we would have today. Somebody might want 2 chickens in exchange for a finished farming tool. Somebody else might give 5 chickens for the same item. Or the toolmaker may change their price for chickens depending on the person, or if they even want chickens that day. The same can be done for animal pelts, crops, services, just about anything. Chickens, and many other animals and crops, don't last too long, and who knows how many or how much you needed to carry with you to trade for what you wanted. This limited trading to small deals. Bartering is the most simple form of trade, but it is highly unorganized. This is not a good system for growing cities. All over the world, as societies grew more complex, many developed some form of money, whether that be beans, textiles, shells, or the more familiar forms of gold and silver. Governments often tried to regulate what could be used as a tool of exchange. There were some historical exceptions, such as the Inca, who built their great civilization without the use of any uniform money, unless you count human labor as the main system of exchange. But for most cultures, something that was easily stored, easy to carry, and easy to count and make change made trade much more efficient, allowing some people to begin developing a good amount of wealth. With money, one didn't need to bring a bunch of chickens with them or all their wares to trade for something. They could trade those products for money itself and use that money to buy the goods and services they needed. Or a person could borrow some money from local moneylenders and pay them back with interest, as banks as we know them did not exist yet. Now it didn't matter if the toolmaker needed chickens or not that day. You just had to find someone who did, and then trade the chickens for money. Then use that money to go to the toolmaker and buy what you needed. Trade grew exponentially, and money made trading more efficient and easy. Many cultures still used barter for small deals, but large portions of their economies were now being determined by money, especially precious metals like gold and silver, since they were difficult to replicate or find. This did not necessarily mean that governments were the main source of wealth. Wealth was just the ability to buy more goods and services than others. Money is just a tool in itself to make trade between items that others produce more efficient. But many governments encouraged trade, and more importantly, collected taxes in these forms of money, making it the default status of wealth. To make gold and silver coins more official and uniform looking, for example, governments would stamp an image of their ruler on it. This transition from barter to money economies took time, over hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, depending on the location, availability of resources, and other fortunes or challenges of whichever civilization you look at. The complexities of credit and money, population growth and management, welfare and security needs, military protection, and resource acquisition all led to the first government formations, their increasing power over hunter-gatherer group systems, and laid the foundation for our world today. I'll be making more videos on general trends of history, so be sure to subscribe if you are new to the channel, like the video, and click the bell button to help support and be notified for new videos. If you would like to help the channel grow even more, consider helping out on the History Behind the Games Patreon page and earn various credits. Lastly, thank you for watching, and thank you to all my subscribers and those of you here for the first time. I'm Eric, the LonePineWolfman, and remember gamers, never stop learning.